Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Kaufman. Very excited to have this individual with Stephen and I today. We got an inquiry through our website, which, again, anybody who has inquiries about guests, about possible topics with wolves, always reach out to us. Wolf Connection Pod, any way you guys want to reach us. We just really love the community aspect of this and what this whole podcast community has become. And this is where our guest today joins us. She has been the executive director of Alaska Wildlife Alliance for 6 years now. She comes to us from Homer, Alaska, just fresh off of her trip and climate change project over there in the Bering Sea. She is Nicole Schmitt. Nicole, wonderful to meet you and great to have you. How you doing?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm doing well. Excited to talk about wolves.
That's what we do.
Yeah, we're always excited to talk about wolves. Just background on you. Are you a native Alaskan? Were wolves a thing for you? I know animals were always a thing for you. I was reading up on your bio. Where did this, I guess, joy or love for nature and then wanting to help come in? Early age or later on?
That's a good question. I had kind of a split upbringing. I'm originally from Colorado, and but my parents had land in Alaska that we would come up to every summer. And growing up, my family had a cattle ranch, so we often think of ranchers as not necessarily always being allies of wolves, but my parents just always really had an affinity for thinking about the ecosystem and our place in it. And so I grew up in that ethos. And then my dad moved to Alaska full time. So I spent my summers commercial fishing up here. And I had spent a season working for the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. I worked at Yosemite National Park. I kind of got a little bit of an insight into what land and wildlife management looked like. And I was drawn to the work and this place because for those who haven't been, Alaska it's a really captivating, amazing landscape. We have so many just critical and wonderful species. And I was drawn to Alaska Wildlife Alliance because it was an organization that had been founded by Alaskans, and it really focuses on local management of wildlife and mobilizing citizens to be a voice for wildlife. You know, birds and bears and wolves can't go to these public meetings where decisions are made that influence their lives, their habitat, their homes. And so this organization strives to be that voice for wildlife. And I just fundamentally believe that non-human neighbors have a place in these decisions, and I just really believe in it.
Yeah, it seems like you got the whole swath of, land, air, sea, everything just in your upbringing alone, which is fantastic. And the ranching aspect too, which is phenomenal because we want to have all those voices in there. And Alaska Wildlife Alliance was, I think, started in 1978. So it's been around for quite some time. And you gave the gist of what they're doing. That's really great that it was started by Native Alaskans. Is that the main mission statement, is just to get these Alaskans themselves to speak for animals? Is there more to it? And I know there's developed a novel climate change adaptation program. What else is there that AWA really strives to do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so our mission statement could admittedly use some less jargon, I suppose, but our official statement is for the ethical management of wildlife, taking an ecosystem perspective. So we want, basically, instead of managing for a single species, like managing a system for the benefit of caribou or of moose alone, how can we make management systems benefit the whole ecosystem? The theory that, a healthy ecosystem benefits all species, the ones that people care about for hunting and subsistence, and also for the humans in that system. So we really take an ecosystem focus to things. And So with that as our driving mission, we have essentially three programs. One is we call it the Voices for Wildlife, which is what I just talked about. That's bringing the voice and concerns of wildlife to these management decisions. And at times we don't like to go there first, but when necessity calls, we do litigate on behalf of wildlife as well. So that's one program. The other program is our climate adaptation program, and Alaska is warming between 2 and 4 times the rate of the lower 48. We're the only Arctic state in the nation, and we have more coastline than the entire lower 48 combined. And so we have, polar bears, walrus, Arctic fox, snowy owls, all these kind of Arctic critters that you think of. And as humans are trying to deal with climate adaptation planning, we see a responsibility to also make sure that wildlife and biodiversity are considered in that adaptation. And so our role is to make sure that there's adaptation plans for wildlife. So, how can we support walrus as the Bering Sea ice recedes and they no longer have places to haul out? As an example, what are some things that humans can do in our adaptation plans to support wildlife and biodiversity? And then the third, we have an emphasis on recovering endangered and threatened species. And so for us up here, one of the big focuses is cooking the beluga whales, but that's just really, informing the citizenry and Alaskans to speak up for wildlife and recover the species that are most imperiled. So we keep ourselves busy, that's for sure. But we all have a wonderful team, a wonderful board, and great membership.
How does AWA engage with the public? I mean, literally.
Yeah, it's actually right before this, I just got a text alert for our endangered beluga whale program, and so it kind of runs the gamut by program. So that text alert system, we have volunteers watching the rivers to let people know when there's endangered whales, so that if they're boating, they can slow down, or if they want to go see the 280 or so left,
wow,
they can go see them.
That's wild.
But yeah, we have all the classic social media and newsletters with action alerts. We have volunteers all around the state who organize locally. Yeah, it's a lot of it's very, very grassroots networking. And so it's a combination of word of mouth technology and some of these more like press release focused
Very cool
activities.
How have you seen AWA grow in the 6 years that you've been ED? Has there been any things that you guys have looked to hit that you've gotten there? It's like you said, the state in and of itself is so big, and there's so many incredible species there. Where do you as an ED look in terms of your day-to-day or even your year-to-year? Are there like certain goals you try to hit? What does it look like for Nicole Schmitt on that kind of a basis?
Well, the day-to-day is probably not as sexy as most people think of, wildlife advocacy. Yeah. It's a lot of sitting at a desk and calling people, and there's a lot of desk-based research to it. We also have field work, which is very fun, but yeah, we have a strategic plan with goals, so we try and be directed in that way. And when we take on a program, we try to have very specific measurements of outcomes, like what could success look like? And we acknowledge that success in a lot of these issues takes, decades, and success is hard to measure. And so we give ourselves that grace, but we really pride ourselves on being both very nimble and able to react to issues as they come, but also being strategic. And so identifying like a target population, what kinds of things can we do in a 3-year basis and a 10-year basis and then a 30-year basis, and then constantly checking in, building coalitions and partnerships to make sure that we're reaching those goals, and then pivoting if something is not working or not having the effect that we thought it did. And so, with so much of our work, it's very policy kind of minded, because Alaska's wildlife management system is actually political. And so it changes, and we find ourselves trying to, orient to these new kind of political situations. But yeah, day to day, it is mostly coalition building, talking with people, talking with researchers, building out projects, making sure that we're on track, and then trying to get outside and spend time with the wildlife we work so hard to protect.
Yeah, and you mentioned that Alaska's climate is warming significantly faster than the rest of the lower 48. And your website here, it mentions some of these notable present manifestations of such warming, sea ice melting and glaciers receding, et cetera. But can you just go through with us here when you're talking to the public, or you're giving a talk or trying to educate folks on global warming, particularly in Alaska, though in some way it's a warning to the rest of the continent, or to the world. It warns of potential effects as they speed up and compound for everybody. So what are some of the things you reference as examples of current and meaningful effects you're already seeing, whether you'd consider them positive, negative, subjective, but what are some of the things already happening that you feel are important to communicate?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it's interesting, like looking at the messaging for climate, when people are doing kind of climate mobilization and climate solution thinking. In Alaska, my experience has been that everyone around, regardless of where you fall on political spectrum, your age, everyone is seeing the impacts of climate change. And it's just kind of like we don't really have to work hard to convince people that that's happening. People have seen, I myself have seen glaciers recede miles back. And so I think that it's a good question, because we see it in the way that wildlife management works for the state. Each kind of region of the state gets a big batch of proposal changes and regulatory changes every 3 years. So that's kind of the vision that you have. You can look in these 3-year increments, and we're starting to see things like moose moving into the Arctic, in the Western Arctic. And so just last month, there was a regulation. We're seeing caribou decline because permafrost is declining, and that's what caribou need. But we're seeing shrubs move into these areas that had previously just been tundra. And with the shrubs come species like moose and black bear. Also comes with the decline of caribou. We see red fox moving into kind of territory that had previously only really been occupied by Arctic fox. And so, bird migrations are changing, and, you're seeing like walrus having to haul out on, and seals hauling out on smaller areas, leading to more stampedes, things like that. Salmon is one that connects to every Alaskan. We're seeing steelhead and salmon streams becoming too warm for spawning. In fact, a couple of years ago, out in Western Alaska, the spawning streams were 11 degrees warmer.
Whoa.
And salmon were having heart attacks.
That's
it's
wild.
like, it's everywhere. And so I think for us, in a time when you can just get so easily like what can you do as an individual, seeing all these changes and the cascading effects? It's really easy to feel hopeless, but we really try and find solutions to work with wildlife in climate adaptation. So one example is that we have a project with the Ketchikan Bay National Research Reserve, University of South Florida, and University of Alaska Anchorage. And we're in this Homer area doing a project to restore drying peatlands using beavers. So beavers have been largely out-trapped from this area. And as they go, the peatlands are drying because there's nothing to dam it up. And so we're doing research to see how effective are beavers at keeping these peatlands wet, which not only provides habitat for species, but they're also really great at holding carbon. And so how can beavers be an ally in this specific region to moderate or even reverse some of the impacts of climate change and cool streams for salmon, because they create these deep water ponds? So those are the kinds of solutions that we're looking at, because it's just so tragic when you're surrounded by all this loss. That's what our climate adaptation program is trying to find opportunities to, work with nature and have them be our allies.
Man, yeah, it's. I mean, beavers are so important. I mean, that's the one thing I think. I mean, they're one of the keystone species, so it's wild, obviously, that they've been out trapped there, as you were saying. I mean, this seems to be a Midwestern to Western United States, plus obviously Alaska, Alberta issue where we're talking about over trapping, over hunting certain species that are really intent on helping the ecosystem stay as balanced as it possibly can. Obviously, climate change does a lot, and trying to find these solutions, as you know, is very difficult. What's that community wise? And like Stephen, this will be mine before we get into the wolf issue, which is obviously it crosses all these spectrums. How is the community engagement? It really seems like this is something like you almost have like a community science or a community project level base, like you said, grassroots before. Does this people get people? I don't want to say fired up, but more they feel like they can be involved because it's something they can reach for. If it's something in their region that they can see, do you find that there's small pockets all over the place where people find their little niche and then they go and they help out?
Yeah, and one thing that I really love about Alaskans is that I think as a citizenry, we're like one of the most involved groups of people, mostly because our population is around 700,000. Like our state is the size of some small cities, right? And so the likelihood that somebody or will need help at some point from somebody is pretty strong. And then another thing that I really appreciate about Alaskans is that nationwide, we have the most like cross ticket voting. So I think it's really like we have a lot of independence, and not to make this more of a political statement, but I think that it reflects that people are not necessarily like bought into thinking one way entirely. There's a lot of diversity. It's my dog sleeping, having a dream. Just heard that. Sorry. His name is Riley, actually named after the matriarch of the Riley Creek Wolf Pack.
Nice.
Outside of Denali, but
that's so cool.
So yeah, I think that our focus is very much on local solutions. So like the beaver project as an example. Beavers might be a really good solution for South Central Alaska. People are not happy about beavers moving into the Arctic because they're building dams and therefore kind of increasing the warming of some of the Arctic areas. And so we try to take a very local approach to the situations. Alaska is so huge.
Yeah.
I mean, we have rainforests in southeast bordering Washington almost essentially all the way up to the Arctic. And so something that works in one spot might not work in another. Community priorities are different. So I think that's the benefit of having a local organization, is that we can kind of work with people who, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, regardless of, they want by and large their homes to be healthy places. And so figuring out what that means for them and wildlife is a big part of our work. I don't know if that answered the question, but it feels very organic, I guess.
No, you did. No, I agree. I think that to me is wonderful, that you want to have people want their homes to be, like you say, healthy and vibrant and wild. I think this is a lot of the conversations that Steve and I have had, is we're in some places we're losing, I think, what it means to be in a wild place because we've dumbed it down and domesticated it so much to where it's comfortable, as opposed to being like, hey, we were not here first. There are wild beings and wild animals that have been here prior to us. And it's really a strong lead into what, like I said, we got the email from Bill who contacted us at Wolf Connection to talk about what's going on with Denali, the Denali National Park wolves. And we talked about Denali a couple of times on this show, and it was he wanted us to do sort of a revisit about what's actually happening. And just give us the overall gist if you can, Nicole. From what I gathered, I read over the notes of all the props and all the proposals that have been coming down. To me, it seems, and again, correct me if I'm wrong on anything, that targeting, trapping, killing has only increased, or they want more management because of, as you said prior, moose or caribou really are the ones that are sort of declining more so. Moose, not so much. It seems like moose are healthy, but there's this imbalance of wanting to protect the ungulate and then get rid of the predator, which again seems to go across many different states in many different countries. Are we getting the gist of that, or is there something more that we're missing?
Yeah, and for listeners, these poor men had to filter through pages and pages of stuff that we sent. So thanks for reading all that. But yeah, definitely did your homework. So I guess maybe framing what the Denali problem or issue is would be helpful, and then kind of zooming out. So if we think of Denali as more or less kind of a circle, rectangle area, back in the early 80s, it was designated as a national park under this law that is famous in Alaska called the NILCA. And they were trying to get a NILCA through the door. And this was the law that created Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, all those big federal lands allocations, basically. And there were some inholdings in the area that they wanted to set aside for what would become eventually Denali National Park. And that's commonly known as the Stampede Corridor. If you read Into the Wild, this is where he parked his bus, is for context. So to get it across the line, they said, there's inholdings. We're not going to worry about it. We'll just carve out a little rectangle around those inholdings, and we're going to deal with it later in a land trade, probably, but let's just get it across the line. So ANILCA passes, and the big question has been what to do with that little finger of state land. And the reason why that's so important is because the way that the federal managers through the Park Service manage wildlife is very different from the way that the state manages wildlife. They're managing for different things, and they tend to manage for different populations almost. It can feel that way. So this issue has gone back and forth where the land trades have failed, essentially. And it has therefore led people, Alaskans predominantly, to request that the state manage that finger of land or a buffer around Denali National Park to have either no wolf trapping or very restricted wolf trapping, so that they can create, because there is no wolf trapping in Denali National Park or hunting. And so it's basically trying to get the state management to kind of mirror what's happening in the park to honor what was initially intended under ANILCA. So there had been what's called the wolf buffer around, where the state said, okay, we'll have a no hunting trapping zone. And the regulatory board that makes that decision is called the Board of Game. And this is a 7-member board that is nominated by the governor and confirmed by the legislature. There are no designated seats. So the board can be whatever essentially the governor wants it to be. And so in the past 10 to 15 years, the political situation in Alaska has led the Board of Game to be to change dramatically from the board that was in place when the wolf buffer was. So for example, our Board of Game that we have today has no biologists. We haven't had biologists for about 3 years. And 6 of the 7 members are big game hunters or guides. So they will probably make regulations that are in those interests. And that's what we've seen. And so it's really interesting because even in Alaska, people think that the regulations, when people can hunt, how much they can hunt, what methods and means they can do to hunt, the management direction for the state, people think is set by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, basically the biologists. And the reality is completely the opposite. It's a political process. And so when the politics changed, the Board of Game got rid of that buffer and then said, not only are we getting rid of it, you can't bring a proposal to bring it back for 6 years. We're just not going to talk about it.
Wow.
That led us to 2016. And then every 3 years, there have been a number of proposals by the Park Service, by organizations like ours and Denali Citizens Council, or another local Fairbanks group called Alaskans for Wildlife, asking for some version of the wolf buffer to be put back in place. So I think that's kind of like the very rough cut history of the issue. But I think the reason that people are so interested in this particular finger of land is because the Denali caribou herd is the only protected caribou herd in Alaska. And that's kind of hangs out generally on the north side of the park. And so the wolves that spend a lot of time in Denali National Park need to go north through that finger of state land. And under state regulations, there's bear baiting, where you put kind of a barrel of dog food or grease-soaked donuts to lure bears, and then you can shoot them. And there's wolf trapping. And so it's kind of this death zone that the wolves and bears have to go through as they pursue the Denali caribou herd. And so that's led to a decline in wolf viewing. In the years that the wolf buffer was in place, wolf viewing was at around 44%. After the wolf buffer was removed, it dipped to 20%, and then now down to about 1%. And then there's also, I think, a really important scientific angle from this is that Denali National Park has been doing a study on wolves for decades. And that's really important. Long-term data sets are very, very important to have. And this area is changing dramatically with climate. And so having and maintaining a long-term wolf study is really important. There are literally a handful of trappers who trap in this area. And while they might not have a huge, an outsized impact on the wolf population at large, they're often trapping the leaders of the packs that are known to go in and out of Denali. And so you see a lot of disruption with the packs that people love, see in Denali because of this conflict on this finger of land. And so when we talk about the wolf townships or the Stampede Corridor, and Alaska, everyone knows, like, oh, that's that really contentious little finger of land outside of Denali National Park. And I guess to finish this monologue, there's the actual issue of what to do with that Stampede Corridor, which is being battled around in the Board of Game meetings. But if you zoom out wider, just like you were saying, John, all around Denali, and honestly, all around Alaska, we're seeing an increase in bear baiting allowances. We're seeing kind of two kinds of predator control. There's capital P predator control, which is like official state-sponsored predator control, where ADF&G biologists are shooting wolves and bears from helicopters. They're gassing dens. We have many programs actively happening right now. In fact, in just a couple of weeks, there's a aerial wolf control project happening in Southwest Alaska. And there are some in the interior as well. But they get a lot of flack for those people. It's not very popular to be shooting wolves and bears from helicopters. And so the Board of Game has figured out that another way you can basically do predator control but not get the state so in the spotlight is just to really liberalize the seasons. Use citizens to basically be that predator control. So we're seeing like no limit seasons on wolves that go well into like early summer months when the pelts have no quality. It's not for trapping, for selling the pelt. It's really just to kill wolves. And season expansions, bear baiting. There's a proposal this year to have bucket baiting for bears, which is basically bear snaring. There's a bucket of food, and as they reach in, that snare pulls down. So it's like that's the landscape kind of all around Denali, and then you have it as this microcosm in the Stampede Corridor.
Yeah. I mean, what's the well, down here, it's pretty obvious that a lot of folks just have been made to believe, or someone is putting in a lot of effort to convince us that wolves are decimating ungulate populations. And I don't even know where that's really happening. I'm sure they're changing a lot of behaviors, and I'm sure populations are fluctuating when new predators are released, but they're certainly not decimating ungulates as far as we can tell from all the biologists we've talked to, and we're at like episode 200 or whatever we're at. So what is that? Is there a similar belief in the Denali area? Is it I mean, with the local figures, is the gripe about regulating wolf hunting to match what's going on in the park? Is it a resistance towards treating wolves in a special way? Because we have heard that a lot, where it's like, we just want this, we want to be able to hunt this animal like we can hunt every animal. We don't want them being treated in a special way. Or is it simply this belief that caribou numbers are fluctuating or being decimated by wolves?
There is definitely a strong narrative put forward by the state that that the wildlife management, human management absolutely needs to pay attention to predators, because, predator and prey dynamics are things that, exactly, that wolves can have a huge impact on caribou and a huge impact on wolves. Obviously wolves and bears prey.
They eat,
Right, of course.
they eat ungulates.
Yeah.
Yes. And a big thing is calf survival here. Calves are the most vulnerable, of course. But in all the literature that's been peer reviewed, and there was another one that just came out a couple of years ago by former ADF&G biologists who were doing a study in Game Unit 13, which is just south of Denali, like it borders Denali on the southern part. And they said that essentially that the finding of the study was that in any long-term level, you could have helicopters out shooting all day, but you can't maintain the artificial rise that comes in ungulate populations when predators are suppressed by humans. It's just not sustainable.
Right.
And one predator control program, the one in Southwest Alaska, cost $500,000 and for 3 weeks. And that's just not sustainable. It can't be on a landscape level. And so there is definitely that narrative pushed. And I think for caribou in particular, there are very few solutions to the habitat being permafrost is going, and that's what caribou generally need. There are disease outbreaks that don't have any kind of feasible vaccination solution. And so I think when people are pinned against the wall and they see these huge changes in populations, it's very easy to scapegoat predators when you say, well, look, they killed, 200 calves. Well, were those compensatory mortality is very different. Would those calves have made it, or were those calves diseased? And wolves have been found to help moderate. Any predator helps moderate disease, helps move caribou along so they don't eat themselves out of house and home. These species evolved together, and it's, I think if you looked holistically from an ecosystem perspective, there is no justification for predator control because it just doesn't work. And there are systems changing that predators are often scapegoated for. And we're seeing some calls for wolf control just outside of Denali National Park because of declining moose numbers, and yet there are no moose surveys in those areas, so no one really knows. And so it's kind of become the default back pocket solution
It's just
to
crazy.
pull forward to say well, it's a tough situation, let's just kill more wolves and bears. And the other thing that I think is important is that Denali National Park, when they're looking at wolves, they're tracking on a pack level. They're looking deep into those dynamics. The state just says there is no conservation concern for wolves or bears in the state of Alaska. They're looking at this broad area. And so, of course, 20 wolves in one population isn't going to have a big deal because that's not the scale that they're looking at. And so you see a lot of ADF&G comments that say there's no conservation concern, but the scale that they're looking at is so huge that it can see that.
Yeah. And also, I think the evidence is, there's studies coming out, just associating the health of populations of predator species. Linking it to the health of biodiversity, just in general. And as much as we as human hunters, we can certainly help to manage prey numbers, but we're not thinking instinctually in the same way that predators are thinking. And so we can't take we can't occupy the niche that like genuine, animal predators are managing. And it's like, I think the research is pretty nuanced that predators really do have an effect on biodiversity. And I think the answer, at least to like, what can we do? What's the thing that we can do as human beings to help either slow the process of climate change or I guess help the transition be smoother and more healthy and productive is to constantly be in support of more and more and more biodiversity. And we've mentioned it before that, in a lot of cases for hunted species, regulations are fairly considerate of habitats and particular migratory routes and their specific dynamic, their specific species level dynamic and behavior. But it seems we do bypass that thought process when it comes to predators. And so we hear that a lot from different states. So it's just as you're speaking about it, it's a very familiar approach.
Yeah. I mean, the rhetoric is you're right. It's very familiar. It's very similar when you talk about boards of individuals making massive ecological decisions and there's no scientific based individuals there about the political shifts. When we talk to Carter Niemeyer at length, these are things that are just coming through each of these states more and more. That, like you say, the populations are changing, the climate itself is changing, and yeah, Stephen, you're right that the bigger global picture is being ignored, and that we are unfortunately, as a species, just not helping in any way, shape, or form. And then the monetary issue comes too. When you say $500,000 for 3 weeks, as a state, that's just unsustainable. You can't do that over the course of it or over a month or a couple of months, let alone years of trying to do this. Does this dissuade, from your perspective, Nicole, is there a disconnect? Clearly, it seems there's a disconnect from those who are in power at the moment making these decisions. Is there a disconnect in the communities that you guys work with, or are they fairly equipped or knowledgeable to understand their surroundings? Because you were saying before, these people really want their homes to be vibrant, to be sustainable. They want their homes to be good. So is there a disconnect on the ground level that you can see, that you can speak to if you can, or is it just something that's, like you say, slowly been shifting or shifting quick in the last 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, so I think that to give credit to rural communities are the ones who are seeing, where their homes are mostly seeing these conflicts. Like there's no wolf debate in Anchorage, really. There just aren't wolves there. But subsistence is a huge part of Alaskan life for tribal entities, but also for rural non-tribal entities. And I think that I've spoken with people who live in areas where there have been bear and wolf predator control. And the comment that I hear the most is, we don't love shooting bears from helicopters or, gassing dens of wolves, but we don't have enough caribou or we don't have enough moose and we need moose to eat. And this is the solution that has been provided to us. And so, and that ranges from people who absolutely believe in predator control. And predator control is like a big statement. I mean,
right, it is.
Humans, I think, have been doing predator control forever. A lot of villages don't want bears and wolves in their neighborhood, or in their village, and they'll, make sure that doesn't happen. When we're talking about landscape-wide predator control, that's very different. And I think that there's been this sort of slow creeping of, we're having more technology. We can fly, we can go by snow machine, we can out with AR-15s, you can now position wildlife can be legal in certain spots of Alaska. You can just kind of drive around them to kind of get them into a better position. And I think in the transition with technology and kind of just this steady narrative against predators, it's sort of become the default thinking. And I think that there's been some effort locally to reconnect with some of the more like traditional thoughts around wildlife, and seeing wildlife as a relationship that you have. You know, there are a lot of Alaska Native communities and traditions that have some aspect of that. Granted, I mean, subsistence is hard and you shoot things when you need to eat, and that's understandable in that context. So, yeah, I think it ranges, but by and large, I would say that many rural communities are supportive of predator control, and often the ones who are asking for it. And I think it's unfortunate because it's the only solution that the state has provided. And so it's the one that they're going to ask for. And I think a couple of things on those last comments, which I think were so spot on about, you know, and all these changes, like biodiversity is the thing that might be able to save us. And the systems that we have in place are just not designed for it.
Right.
Like, let's get the best board of game in the world on the stand. The way that it's, you know, we have a board of game and a board of fish. So when, you know, how can you tie together game and fish regulations, even though game, like beavers, are hugely impactful, and the things that you do to beavers could really impact fish, and forage fish can have an impact on, you know, other large game species. And the division of habitat is totally separate. And so when you're looking at these solutions, I mean, I do feel bad for board of game members in a way, because the only tools that they have are hunting season limits, methods, and means. And the situation is just, it is integrated, it is complex, and we need to have, I think we just need to have systems that are capable of seeing that. We've siloed ourselves to make it more digestible, and I think we're seeing the consequences of that because ecosystems are just not siloed that way. And then the other thing is that the way that the system has played out is we're all battling over allocation of ungulates between people. There's resident hunters, there's non-resident hunters, you know, people are fighting over, well, we want 20 moose, so then the out-of-state residents can get 20 trophy moose, and then tribal and subsistence users want a piece. The problem with that pie is there is no piece of for non-humans. And so that's, I think, another big part of our role is to say, not all of these moose are for people, and not all of these caribou. We understand that people hunt and fish and rely on these, but where's the allocation for wolves, like specifically for wolves, and not as a bad thing, just as a fact of life? Where's the allocation for bears? And so I think just trying to change that thinking is really, really hard, because that narrative is very strong right now.
It's just the fact that we've overmanaged the ecosystem to a point where it can, you know, if you, I think I said this a couple episodes ago, is that if we would just leave nature to its devices, it was going along pretty good there for, I don't know, millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years. And when we stuck our nose in, and it started, I think, and again, I'll just, speaking from a North American or an American standpoint of moving across the West, and when you obliterate the amount of species and the amount of populations that were done there, it takes a long time for that stuff to reset. And now there's really only very few places where those things can reset, where people can see these creatures and these critters. And again, I go back to the ecotourism part too, that we talked at Yellowstone at length about with a lot of this stuff. People want to see these animals. They don't necessarily want to hunt them. They don't want to eat them, whatever. And I get sustainable hunting. I completely understand it. And I, especially up in Alaska, and I understand that is a tough way to live. There is, you know, and it is native, and that is absolutely, to me is more connected and rooted in the ecological aspect than any of the other stuff that happens when, like you say, we parse out X amount of moose or caribou for whoever comes and wants to hunt. Where do you see, I know there was one prop that you guys agreed on that was 186, and I know you have a short amount of time, so I want to get to it before you have to go. I know this is like, Nicole wasn't kidding, reading through pages of this stuff. And a lot of it is very negative. A lot of it was very trap more, shoot more, night vision, aerial hunt. It was just one after the other. It was just sort of like parsing in different things. And again, no scientific research behind it, behind the caribou herd, behind the moose populations. So we don't even know what's going on there. Are they healthy or not? There's no distortion there. Either way, the scientific evidence isn't even being allowed into the room, or the people that would know this to a degree. I don't want to speak, put words in your mouth, Nicole. I'm sorry if I am. But anyway, Prop 186 was seeking to restore a prohibition on wolf harvest in portions of Unit 20C, bounded by Denali National Park on 3 sides. So this is getting back to, this is basically restoring the buffer zone. Is that essentially what 186 is? Is that restoring the buffer zone and giving that area to give wolves a shot? Is that essentially what that is?
And I will clarify, and I think I've kind of misled here, but so our board, the decision makers, not biologists, at these meetings, so in 2 weeks, there's a meeting to discuss all the proposals that are put forward, proposal 186 among them, which you just talked about, John. And at that meeting, ADF&G will present what they think, and then the board will vote, and the public comment period, every public can comment, and then ADF&G presents, and then the board makes their decision. So there is ADF&G advises the board to an extent, and these areas are huge, and there's just not a lot of, we don't know the population of wolves or bears or moose or caribou, because it's a huge area and it's so hard. But yeah, so proposal 186 is to reinstate a smaller buffer. There have been a number of different buffers. There was one that was pretty big. It kind of went around the eastern border of the park as well. So this would be to reinstate the buffer in that finger of land, that Stampede Corridor. And what reinstating the buffer means is no hunting or trapping of wolves. And so that is and the proposal is put forward by the National Park Service. So they're the ones asking the state for this. And so at that meeting, there will be people testifying before the Board of Game saying that they want that or don't want that. And Alaska Wildlife Alliance will be there to support the proposal. And our, AWA has been involved in this issue for decades, probably really since this land was allocated in the way that it was. And so in some ways it seems like it could be a solution to fulfill what the intent was from ANOCA, which was in the 80s. And so is that relevant anymore? Some people say no. I think for our organization, it is the overwhelming support, meeting after meeting after meeting, has been for some kind of wolf protection in this specific area for these specific kinds of wolves. And for almost 2 decades, it has been rebuffed to favor the trapping preferences of a few. And I see this as kind of a compromise proposal, because all around Denali National Park, you can trap, really. It's just this one biologically significant area that, there are many people who are involved in it for the viewing aspect. Others more involved because they want to not see disruption in the scientific studies of wolves from Denali National Park. And I think for this, my request to the Board of Game is that it's such a small ask. There are 2 trappers that trap there. And a lot of people care about this. There have been House bills in the legislature to ask for this. There have been petitions. There have been multiple land trades. Like, it would be a pretty small ask. And I think it would mean a lot to the scientific community and to people who want to view wolves in the park. And would not shut down trapping in the area.
You said 2 trappers?
To my knowledge, there's two trappers. Yep, 2 to 5. That's kind of.
All right. So what is going on then? Because what is it about the trapping tradition specifically? Do you think that it has proportionately high favoritism, at least to the amount of people who participate it's got to be something more than trying to protect the tradition or to simply get votes. There aren't enough participants to justify ignoring a large group of people that are advocating for a certain area and a certain species. It has to be something else. What is the incentive, do you think, to sort of tirelessly protect the trapping status quo, particularly in comparison to the hunting tradition, which has a lot of regulations, particularly in a situation like this where the ask is, in my mind, really reasonable?
I think you've nailed it. I don't think it's actually about necessarily those trappers. And actually, I have come to know one of
Can't
them
be.
quite well, and we spend our time very differently. But and he wants to trap there because he lives right there. He's seen it and has trapped there forever. And and yeah, but
anyone can get that part.
I think
that's
relatable.
Think
that this has become in essence sort of like a proxy war for this growing tension on the state side against federal management. The state really, under the current administration, building up to this, we have funds coming into the state for statehood defense, saying the state should manage resources, not the feds. There is a lot of pushback that we constantly get requests from the state to do predator control on federal lands, and the federal land managers say, no, that's wildlife refuges and parks. That's not what we do. It's worth mentioning that there are Native organizations that don't have members actively trapping in this area, but support the trappers because they don't want any more conditions on land that restrict hunting and trapping. The park is seen by many Alaskans as this place. Well, let me just read. ADF&G submitted their comments against Proposal 186. So I have them for you and I can read them. They say the department opposes this proposal because wolves are managed at a population level and not the UCU, which basically means like that small level. And this proposal is an unnecessary loss of opportunity for subsistence users and others who hunt and trap wolves. There are no biological concerns as the harvest of wolves in the proposed area is low and has no effect on the area's sustainable wolf population. Again, because the area's sustainable wolf population is huge, so that they don't care about packs, right? And then they say, additionally, Denali National Park is closed to the hunting and trapping of wolves, providing 4.7 million acres of refugia directly adjacent to the proposed closure area. And so people in this area who are opposed to the wolf buffer say, you have 5 million acres of closed area. Why do you want any more? And on the one hand, I can understand that when you think about it in that term. On the other, it's a tiny section asking to make that ecosystem truly intact because there's just that finger is really, really disruptive. And so I think it's not really about the trappers. It's not even really about the wolves. My personal opinion is I think it's this standoff of the state saying we will not manage like the feds because we are not the feds. And I find that argument really tiring and it's so shallow, right? Because it's not, the conversation is not at the level of like, what about the specific area is biologically important? What can we learn? What are the details? Like really like digging into the issue. It's almost more of a value signaling than anything. And I think that's where we've been at an impasse. And I think that there will just need to be some genuine members on the board, genuine representatives from ADF&G to say, what is it that each side is really trying to achieve? For our side, we're not trying to have federal overreach over state management. That's all we're asking for. We're asking for it for these very specific reasons. But those reasons are never really discussed.
It's like the give an inch, take a mile fear thing.
Absolutely. I mean, and we see that with trapping. We've put proposals we have on our website, it's called Map the Trap, because trapping regulations are so liberalized in Alaska. You can trap. There were 4 dogs caught in the Homer Elementary School ski trails last year because you can trap literally anywhere. And if you move the traps, you're tampering with a lawfully set trap. And we've asked for 50-yard buffers from ski trails, designated ski trails.
Jeez.
And that argument has been, if you give an inch, take a mile, you're going to shut down trapping. And we're just asking for buffers around pullouts, beaches, roads, where ski trails, where dogs have been known to be caught and killed in traps. And it's just kind of crazy.
Yeah, I feel like it almost feels like we're still sort of waiting for the actual answer to this question, no matter how many times we've discussed it. Just about the like I said before, the favoritism or the protection of the status quo. Because rifle hunting, shotgun hunting, muzzle loaders, bow hunting, etc., they all have many more regulations, tangible ones. You can't just accidentally kill unintended targets. You can't shoot someone's dog. You can't leave animals to suffer or meat to go to waste, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what is the thing about trapping where all of these things are happening and we can just bypass all of the pressure to do it quickly and to do it humanely and to be expected to do it in such a way that mitigates or eliminates unintended results? I don't know the ins and outs of trapping, but that's perplexing.
Yeah. It's definitely been interesting. And we've been, trying to work with the Alaska Trappers Association to come up with some compromises where compromises can be made. And it's like it falls back on a heritage and a way of life, I think that feels particularly nostalgic. And I think so the kind of conversation about, nature being what happens when humans like over meddle, I suppose, with nature is that, humans are a part of nature. We have always been impacting things. I think that we've always there have been two ways that humans have moderated themselves. There's been some cultural moderations, which some cultures had more or less of, right? Like that's very diverse. But I think the real limiting factor was mostly technology. Like we just couldn't fly planes or drive snow machines or have automated weapons or night vision goggles, and I think, I think that we look at things as business as usual. We've been allocating this way for, since the 1900s or whatever. And I think we really need to reflect on what technology affords us and where we need to rethink these things. I think a whole scale revisiting of how we're doing things, because it's just not
fucking crazy
working. We're on the brink of a mass extinction of climate change. But until then, we will be trying to, while we're working on that in the background, we will continue to try and, steer the ship with these micro adjustments in ways that can be most, ethical and trying to be a voice to the wildlife that we have right now and speak for them and try and get some concessions there, while also, we're very aware of this bigger picture and that can be daunting. But I think it's people like you who bring information forward and listeners who care about this. And, I just think more humans that feel a responsibility to care for and speak up for the non-humans that can't speak is the only way we're going to get out of this. So
listen, everyone, we may disagree on some things, but this is not a drill. This is not a fake scenario. This is happening, and we need to think long term. We're looking at serious change, and we have to think big picture if we're going to leave our kids with a chance.
Yeah. And killing wolves is not going to stop it.
Yeah, absolutely. Killing any predators is not. Yeah, wolves especially.
Yeah, and we can't just be hell bent on protecting our identities. It's not going to fix any of it. It's not going to save us.
Absolutely not. Nicole, real quick, last question. When you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Wow. So in working on the Denali issue for so long, had the privilege and pleasure of looking at some of the wolf cameras and or the camera sites at the dens, and the rendezvous sites for wolves where they learn how to play. It's kind of like a preschool, sort of a wolf preschool. Seeing the footage from that where, they'll take like bones and feathers and just play with. It reminds me so much of my dog, honestly. But I just, yeah, that footage of really playful baby wolves. I want to try and keep that because I've seen a lot of dead wolves and maimed wolves as well. But I'm really, actually, that was a good exercise. I'm glad that I defaulted to that.
That was the first thing.
It's a reflection of mental health, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. I like it.
Oh, that's great. Nicole Schmitt, you're a champion. Thank you for being a voice for the voiceless. Really appreciate all the information. You're welcome back anytime. Keep doing what you're doing. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. Hell's Steel out there, and be with you next time. Bye, everybody.
Yeah, come visit.
We will.
Oh, yeah, 100%.
100%. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.